All right, so we're back with the second episode of The Reckoning, where, like I said, I'm going to be sharing raw stories of entrepreneurship, starting a company and, all the process that goes along with that. The first episode, I actually just dove into my first experience. And like I said, this is supposed to be raw, so it's not scripted. I'm aiming to share the information that I think it's gonna be worthwhile, and I'm going through it live, right? And so it's not polished, and bear with me as we go through the entire comfortable process together, because I don't want to sort of make this seem like it's some sort of glorious or luxurious lifestyle, or glamorous lifestyle. And so I'm just literally pointing the camera and shooting, to really share the ins and outs of entrepreneurship. So all right, in the previous episode, we talked about how I, basically had this idea after coming back from Europe, and that turned out to be Uber and Lyft, right? That was that. That was a start. From there, the next thing I did after that, and I mean, if we want to keep this chronological, I think that's probably one of the ways to do it, because after that, learning, of course, that Uber and Lyft were basically exploding, that was neat. I was like, okay, on to the next thing. And that next thing for me was actually launching a clothing brand, in the US and in Germany. And as it happened, I'm actually in Argentina right now. So, I think that's going to be a complete different story that I'll share. Again, this is all part of the sharing, the raw part of being an entrepreneur, right? Of starting a company, and so, but we'll come back to the Argentina story. So I launched this clothing brand in the U.S. and in Germany, and I will say I just didn't see myself as someone who would become like some sort of apparel mogul, or apparel don, whatever. I'm not sure what the word would be, but I just didn't see that as a long-term thing that I could do, right? Or that and so for me, it was very much a hobby, right? It was a hobby because I happened to have had, a bunch of designs laying around, because, when I was 16, I started a software development agency, that ultimately actually ended up merging with another company, which again, that story will come out as well later. But because of that, I had these designs kind of laying around, and in my mind, I was just like, it'd be cool to turn these into like some sort of clothing, or something that I can put on a sweater, on a hoodie, or some t-shirts, right? And so I ideated it a little bit. I thought about it, but I didn't want to just create a clothing line just like everyone else was doing, right? A lot of people, they're just calling it a clothing line if they just put a logo on some sort of existing hoodie, right? That's a clothing line. And I was like, what's the point of that, right? And so I remember for me, I was like, even though I kind of didn't think this was sort of and what I mean by this is this. I do believe that to be an entrepreneur, a certain type of entrepreneur, depending on the business that you're tackling, it requires different types of personalities, right? And I think I've found, and if I'm in maybe I'm not boasting, or maybe I'm not sure what exactly it is, but I think this will also come later too. Because basically what I'm trying to say is that I think intuitively, even though I was doing this for fun, I kind of knew that it wasn't challenging enough. There we go. It wasn't challenging enough launching a clothing brand, right? I mean, it just wasn't, right? To me, it didn't challenge my, I didn't feel as though I was even close to capacity, right? In terms of challenging myself, solving a problem, tackling many different aspects of society, and having an impact, or making a change in the world, right? And so it remained purely as a hobby, right? As something to do to potentially just make some money, right? Make a quick buck, in a sense that, it's merchandise, right? Sell it, get revenue, sell it, get more, and just keep going, right? And so, but I think that's how I saw it. I certainly didn't see it as something I would do long term. I thought about it a little bit, but again, I think ultimately it just came back down to it didn't challenge me enough, right? As an individual, as a person, I didn't feel as though I was putting all my abilities and skills, right, into use running a clothing line, right? But nevertheless, I did it, right? It was a time when, I was able to source material from, manufacturers in China, actually, right? And I think without getting into too much of the details here, because again, this is what I mean. The clothing line wasn't something that I thought was like so arduous, so hard, and you had to like challenge yourself, right? For me, it was something that could be done very quickly, and I did, right? And so then we launched. But what was exciting or interesting about that experience is that, as I've grown a little bit, right, and I meet people who are, much older than me or maybe around my age, and they're just now discovering, aspect of manufacturing, right, sourcing manufacturers from China. It takes me back to those moments where I'm like, wow, okay, I was doing those things in my, like, literally at 2021, right, in my early 20s, basically as a kid, right, and they're just now discovering that. So, all these experiences, I think for sure, have painted or given me, I guess, maybe skill sets, right? That in many ways, some people are just now discovering, and I'm like, I was doing that when I was, a kid, right? And in many ways, it allows me to, and I don't want to, overly index on this, but I will say that it's allowed me to be someone who can give perspective of many different fields, right? As a result, I mean, that's just fact, because I've actually tackled so many things as a kid, right? When I started that web development agency, I mean, I was doing a bunch of IT work that, it was actually kids who have graduated, or people who have graduated college, who were allowed anywhere near like, an Ubuntu terminal, right, on a Linux system, setting up an enterprise security platform or an enterprise, network, right? I was already doing all those things when I was in my teens. So a lot of these things, shape my perspective, and I can look at many different industries or many different careers and just give people's perspective on how to actually quickly accelerate or just improve or get things better. I mean, again, I think it ultimately just meant that I can talk about so many different topics without necessarily having, for lack of a better word, the formal education in it, right? I think that may be the difference, because I've actually had experience, right, in when I was so young. So anyway, so back to the clothing line, and so to the clothing line, I think that was just an experience, right? Like I said, it was purely a hobby. I kind of knew that it wasn't going to be long term, but we did it. What was amazing is that, and I want to just share some tactical perspectives here in terms of, we talk about how do you grow a company, right? When we launched that collection, or when I launched the collection for the clothing line, we sold 75% of the inventory in about 2 weeks, right? My first batch, it was actually 600 pieces, 600, hoodies, right? We sold 75% of that like in 2 weeks. And I remember I was just so amazed. I was like, this is great, this is amazing. But here's how we actually did it. Here's how I was able to do it. It was because while I was designing, mind you, I actually designed the entire hoodie from the ground up, right? Like in terms of the actual design of the hoodie itself. So much so that we actually had our own label, right, on the back of it, because it wasn't like, we weren't just slapping design. And I keep saying we, but that's just a very typical way of me, thinking when I think about building a company. Is more like a team, but this one was just me, right? And so, I was truly building a label there, right? And so, I built it. So anyways, I see like the whole we thing, it's sometimes it trips me up a little bit. Anyways, because I like to think always of a company as global, right? And what I mean by that is, there's many people who always put their hands in, right, to get you to where you are. And so it always comes out to we for me, Although I definitely, get, I think I definitely for sure have gotten better at using I if it's, me who's really, you know, I guess making a contribution somewhere. But anyways, so the reason and how we were able to sell 75% of the inventory in 2 weeks was because before, and as I said, because I was designing the hoodies themselves, right, throughout the process, I was actually documenting this. And what I mean by documenting this was like, I was posting on Facebook, which obviously was the most prominent, social network then. I was, basically teasing, the design, the process with, people who were, friends on Facebook, right? Telling them how I'm launching this clothing line, coming soon. So it was always like coming soon, right? Even though I was just working on the design, or, as I was working on the design, thinking about manufacturers, like posting those content. So I was actually doing all of that before even the clothing line arrived. So that's what made it so that by the time we actually announced the launch, right? I mean, people actually just went in and bought it, right? Because there was a lot of anticipation already building for the product, right? So I think that's actually a key marketing tactic there, and I think, I was actually chatting with one of my investors actually this week, and one of the interesting things, about that process is, if you think about it, that was content creation even before content creation became a thing, right? But I guess in many ways we just didn't have the infrastructure. I mean, right? If Facebook wasn't about having followers, it was actually having friends, right? People who you knew, right? Maybe, it was mostly people who you knew, right? And so it wasn't so much about creating content and then, having people follow you, right? And so, but nevertheless, right, to get this clothing line off the ground, what I did was essentially marketing, right? I was doing marketing. And again, with this conversation with this investor just this week, he actually told me like one of the reasons he invested is because when he met me, he saw that I had all these components, right, of someone who knows how to do marketing, growth marketing, etc. And that's very true. He's very much right. But again, in those times, it wasn't kind of viewed as such, right? I was just like, I'm creating this thing, and I was just sharing it on Facebook. Right? And I think maybe Instagram a little bit because it was super early, super new. I think Instagram came out in 2009, I believe. I can't remember, so don't quote me on that. But this clothing line, timeline, again, I don't think it's really worth mentioning, but I think I started it in 2013, right? And so, but most of the marketing was on Facebook, right? Where I was posting the journey, right? Teasers, pictures, of things along the way. So that by the time again we launched, right, and it went live, literally 75% of it, like, boom, was sold. So I was really excited about that, and actually throughout the process, a lot of my friends bought the merchandise, which was great because again, I was literally teasing this on Facebook for the majority of the time, and so. That really draws a parallel. I mean, as I'm actually talking about this right now, it draws a massive parallel with what's happening in the world now, which is all about, distribution, right? Building the audience before you sell a product, right? Again, I did not know that's what I was doing back then. I was just doing it because it just felt organic and necessary, right? I think if I had known that there was some sort of strategy behind it, I probably wouldn't have stopped. Even after, like the clothing line was, one story for the book, or like even after I went beyond the clothing line, right? It just, I think it felt natural to just do it, right? Share what I was doing with people, right? Without expecting much from it. And I think that's the key. That's the, and that's what I mean. There's so many parallels right now where, you should be building your audience before you actually build the product. Right? Because it's the audience that actually brings you the revenue. It's the audience that actually, makes you money, right? That cares about you, that actually values your voice, right? And what you have to sell ultimately, right? But, you get to that point by providing value to your audience, right? In whatever form, shape, or whatever form it takes, right? I mean, it could be, through entertainment, right? Again, this is actually why we have creators now. Right, and everyone actually reveres creators now, really value creators now, right? Because ultimately they build an audience first before they go in and suddenly they're like, oh, we're launching this product. But guess what? By that time, you already have an audience that already follows you, that trusts you, that believes in you, and suddenly your products are flying off the shelves, right? And so it takes care of marketing for you automatically, like no brainer, right? And so, and I think, and I think given I'm actually talking about this, it taps into my current company, right? Versa, which is, the operating system for the creator economy, right? At Versa, we help, brands launch campaigns so they can actually pay creators directly, right? But most importantly, creators can actually use our platform, right, to, create a store, right? And, like this is not supposed to be overly advertising the company, but I think there's a parallel here, right? There's an actual parallel. Where creators can actually, create their store, add a tip jar, sell courses, right? Activate a subscription, right? And so with that, it actually allows the creator to monetize their audience, right? And that's what I keep saying. It's like we're in a world now where, we're in a world now where by having the audience, it's easy to just drop a link and be like, hey guys, like, I just launched this, check it out, right? And, with the laws of conversion, right? Essentially your audience becomes your top of funnel, right? Let's say you have 500K followers, 1 million followers, however many followers, right? If you drop your link, right, to a follower count or an audience of 500K, right? Maybe 100K of that audience actually sees the video, right? Or the content that you posted, right? Maybe out of that, another, 50K, for example, right, engages or interacts with us. Like, oh, that's cool, right? Like Jack, we know he's been like doing this cool thing so far. That's amazing. Let's check it out, right? And then let's say, another 10,000, right, actually clicks the links and purchases something. That's massive revenue right out of the gate, right? And so, when you think about the top of funnel and the conversion metric, right, that's exactly how it works, right? Where you go from, having a large following that you've gathered through a lot of work, such as building, entertaining and, things of that nature, to now suddenly you drop a link and by law of conversion in the funnel, 10,000 people out of 500K have purchased your product, right? Now, let's say your product is, let's just make it even super easy. Let's say it's $199. That's now, a solid, I want to say that's actually now a solid 20K that you just made, right? Right? Because 10,000 people bought your essential $2 product, right? So that's 20K that you just made right off the bat like that, right? And so, and now imagine the product is $10. Boom, that's 100K that you just made right there, right? And again, from there, don't even get me, talking about it, right? If it's a $20 product, right? If it's a $50 product, right? Suddenly you've just made 500K because 10,000 people bought your $50 course or product, right? And then you didn't have to actually individually reach out to each and every single one of those people to buy it, right? It's because you spend the time building the audience, right? Before selling the product. So now the trust already exists. And so you don't actually have to, spend any more time trying to establish the trust, right? Or even, better yet, or chase them one by one, right? Which in the traditional business sense, will take you years to get there, right? But because you've built that credibility, you build that audience, right? Before you drop the product, boom, suddenly revenue's flowing in like crazy, and that's cash flow, right, for any business. So, I think that should be it for this episode. I think, tune in for the next one. I think, I want to say, and I think, I've shared some gems here that, let me not say that, but, I think, again, let me know. I want your feedback and thoughts and perspectives because, as I said, this is, completely raw, unscripted, to share the in and outs of entrepreneurship, right? Building from the ground up, the ugly, the good, and the in between, right? And so, if this was helpful, let me know in the comment below. And as we're jumping into episode 2 here, don't forget to follow along, for episode 3, right? And the other ones coming along. So again, don't forget to follow along, and I'll see you in the next episode. Cheers.